Hi, everyone. Welcome to a celebration of Paradise Bronx by Ian Frazier, who will be speaking this evening with Zach Helfand. I'm going to do a quick intro, and then they'll talk, and we'll have a Q&A and a signing after. This event is being live streamed on YouTube, and it'll be archived on the PCG Studio website. Ian Sandy Frazier is the author of Travels in Siberia, Great Plains, On the Res, Lamentations of the Father, and Coyote v. Acme, among other works, all published by FSG. Zach Helfand is a writer and editor of Talk of the Town at The New Yorker, and we'll get right into it. I'll pass it on to Zach. Thanks.
It's nice to be here with you, Sandy.
I appreciate you doing this, Zach.
You have a long list of books I always like to add. Well, not always. Like we've done this before, but Dating Your Mom. I just like to say it's a great title for a piece and for a book.
Almost 50 years ago.
Yeah. You started this book, which is great. You said you set out to walk 1,000 miles in the Bronx. How did that come to be? And what did you get in particular from walking that you wouldn't have gotten from driving or riding your bike?
Well, I would never have tried to ride a bike because I would only get in accidents, but a little louder. It isn't even on?
It's on, just speaking to them.
The speaker is doing what?
Just talk a little closer to that.
Okay. I started walking in the Bronx I did a piece about Co-op City, which is in the Northeast Bronx, in, I don't know, like 2004. And so I can say I've been going up there for 20 years, but I really did a lot of walking when I did a piece about the Stella D'Oro Bakery. And you probably are familiar with Stella D'Oro cookies. They still exist. But they went through some difficult times, and they were bought eventually by a hedge fund in Greenwich, Connecticut. And the hedge fund, this was had been a community, like a business that was locally owned. And the hedge fund, which is only like 25 miles away in the richest county in the U.S., had all these draconian measures that it imposed on Stella D'Oro in the poorest, one of the poorest parts of the country. And that just got me kind of riled up. And so I went and I hung out with the people that were striking there. And that strike lasted 11 months. So I got to know the place kind of from that. And then for me, the great contribution that Stella D'Oro made, aside from employing lots of immigrants and, doing all kinds of great things for the community, was it just smelled delicious. And you would get this amazing smell, like you just walked into a kitchen where brownies were baking or something, and the smell was everywhere. It would just permeate this part of the Bronx. And I met people who said, we coming home on the Major Deegan, which runs right behind the bakery, when we smelled that, we knew we were getting home. And so I thought, well, I wonder how far this goes. So I did a kind of systematic study of the smell. So I'd walk a block, yeah, I can still smell it, and walk another block, oh yeah, I can still smell it, and just keep going like that until I had to say, well, if I didn't, it's faded out by this time. But so I went in every direction to see what that aura was in the Bronx. And I just ended up going a lot of different places. On it, if the wind was right, you could go all the way up into Riverdale and you're still smelling it. And so that got me walking in the Bronx. And I hadn't realized how interesting the Bronx is geographically. It's all up and down there in that part. It's It's very, it has these valleys that are north-south valleys. And so it just began to more and more appeal to me as a geographic place. And the hedge fund, all kinds of different things happened during the strike, but the hedge fund moved or sold Stella D'Oro to a company that moved it to Ashland, Ohio. And I'm from Ohio, and I'd been to Ashland, and I went out there and did the same thing in Ashland and smelled the thing. And okay. And then I kept following it away, and you're just in this second growth forest, this just weedy, not very interesting forest, and all this delicious smell out in this forest and totally wasted. And just an example of how the Bronx gets screwed, because this is of no use in this forest in Ohio unless there's some greater use to it that I can't imagine. But it was just something that, it got me involved with the Bronx, and that was how I started walking there.
So that,
Huh?
You ever have a cookie?
Oh, of course. Are you kidding me? My wife, who's here, when she was pregnant with my daughter, who's here, ate the breadsticks constantly. And it was like having mice in the walls. You would just hear this. That was my first, I realized, wow, Stella D'Oro is a good product. And it's still not a bad product, even though it's made by Lance Foods, who do those little cheese crackers, which are, from machines, those little weird, anyway. So.
okay, so it started as all good books should with cookies.
Right.
And you have a section of the book that you're going to read for us, right?
Oh, yeah. I was going to just read, just to give you an idea of this geography. The Bronx is a hand reaching down to pull the other boroughs of New York City out of the harbor and the sea. Its fellow boroughs are islands or parts of islands. The Bronx hangs on to Manhattan and Queens and Brooklyn, with Staten Island trailing at the end of the long tow rope of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and keeps the whole business from drifting away on a strong outgoing tide. No water comes between the Bronx, if you leave out its own few islands, and the rest of North America. The Bronx is the continent. And once you're on it, you can go for thousands of miles without seeing ocean again. The other boroughs, for their part, cling to the Bronx for dear life. The chafing and strife of this connection have made all the difference to the Bronx. Excuse me. No other borough has "the" in its name. We don't say the Staten Island or the Manhattan. For some reason, no island is ever called the. Only certain more or less continuous geographic features merit a "the," such as the Antarctic or the tropical rainforest. Before Europeans had any formal name for what is now the Bronx, they referred to it simply as the continent, the mainland, or the main, distinguishing it from the ocean they came on and the nearby islands where they'd settled first. The northernmost part of the Bronx western border is the Hudson River. Then Manhattan fits up next to the Bronx on its western side for more than half its length, lying approximately north and south. Here, the Harlem River, which is a strait and not a river, and which connects the East River to the Hudson, runs between the two boroughs. Steep hills and bluffs rise above the Harlem River Valley. Much of the Bronx is hilly. Stone ridges extend like tendons, knuckles, and fingers from the northern border of the borough southward. These discouraged the construction of east-west roads and made the Bronx difficult to cross from east to west even today. After the Harlem River branches off around one side of Randall's Island, a smaller tidal stream, the Bronx Kill, continues along the borough's southern border. Going along the top of Randall's, the Bronx Kill also flows into the East River, which is part of Long Island Sound, which is part of the Atlantic Ocean. The Bronx's entire eastern border is the East River and the Sound. Thus, the borough has a major river that comes from inland, the Hudson, to its west, and salt water on its east. Some of the Bronx is rocky and wooded like upstate, and some is oceanfront marsh and beach. A straight line with a few bureaucratic zigzags marks the Bronx's northern border. That line is also the border of New York City. In general, people in the suburbs to the north of this line are richer than most people in the Bronx. By some measurements, large areas of the Bronx are poorer than anywhere else in the nation, but that assumes a population frozen in time. Everybody has to start somewhere, and the poor parts of the Bronx are often where people start when they have very little. They work and earn, and in time they move upward, and new arrivals take their place. This cycle has tended to wear out some areas of the Bronx. The Bronx is the part of New York where the city merges into the rest of North America. The process has never gone smoothly.
I love that intro. And I think if you had stripped your name off of the book, I and I'm sure a lot of other readers could have picked out that's a Sandy Frazier opening to a book. So I'm curious, how much of you kind of span the whole history of the Bronx from Glacier to now. How much of the story of the Bronx is the story of geography, is destiny, and how much of it was other factors beyond that?
Well, I mean, I've referred to this as a human geography, and what it does, I look at every place like this, the way the people made the place and the way the place made the people. And the Bronx, as I kind of gigantically simplified it, but the Bronx is a place in between. And being in between has posed a lot of difficulties for this place. So I found that as a way of kind of talking about the history all the way back a long way. So that during the Revolutionary War, the Americans were up in along the Croton River, and the British were right along the tip of Manhattan, and just on the other side of the tip of Manhattan. There was a bridge there called King's Bridge. And that, the space in between, the geography in between, was the neutral ground. And it was a bloody place where the partisans for each side fought back and forth. That in-betweenness was a difficulty for the Bronx in 1777. In the 1960s, the fact that the Bronx was in between all these places that highways had to go essentially came close to destroying the Bronx. And the way I kind of summarize it, I say that when the subways reached the Bronx, and that started in 1905, and it was ran through like 1930, but all these subways reached the Bronx, and it was like spreading a sprinkler system out, and all these plants sprang up. Apartment buildings sprang up all along the subway lines, which are mostly elevated in the Bronx. And that made the modern Bronx. So the sentence that I used kind of to summarize this history, I say that if you want to summarize the history of the Bronx in the 20th century, you can say that the subways created the Bronx and the highways almost destroyed it. That Terrence mentioned, this is the 50th anniversary of the Power Broker, which is a story, much of it is about how the Cross Bronx Expressway was pushed through the Bronx. And this is 6.5 miles of highway, most expensive highway ever built. And if you look at where it went and what was there before, you just see this was like building a military road. This was like an assault. And the difference that it made to the Bronx was inestimable. But there were other highways too. You know, there was the Major Deegan, there was the Bruckner. These other roads came through, bridges, all kinds of infrastructure. It was like they laid it on this place, and the people who planned it, and this goes before Robert Moses, I think honestly did not know anybody in the Bronx. I think the people who planned it were members of the old WASP ruling elite of New York City. And I refer to them as club men because they belong to the Knickerbocker Club, and they belong to the Century, and they belong to all these clubs. And if you look at their circle of acquaintance, you say, you know, all these people who were living there, did you know any of them? You know, did you know the young Harold Bloom is growing up in the Bronx? You know, Ed Koch was a boy in the Bronx. Stanley Kubrick was a boy in the Bronx. Did any of the guys in the clubs know their parents, know their milieu? The Bronx was 80% Jewish, south of what's now the Cross Bronx Expressway. In its entirety, the Bronx was 50% Jewish in 1930. And so I think the Bronx was also just the victim of a severe myopia, to put it kindly, on the part of the people that were running the city at that time.
How do you view this as of a piece, or do you, with the Great Plains, with Siberia, your other books, among your other books? Because at first glance, it seems very different. It seems much more dense, urban than you would think of when you think of Siberia.
Well, the Great Plains and Siberia are both about continents also. So, I mean, this is my way sort of seeing this is a continent too. It's part of a continent. But the other, this didn't strike me until kind of late in this project, but this is a much greener book. I flew to Russia many, many times. I drove 15,000 kilometers in one trip that ended on September 11th, 2001. And on the Great Plains, I drove just all over the place. I would spend weeks at a time just driving from Canada down to Texas. And this I could do entirely by foot and with public transportation. So I live in New Jersey. I would take Jersey Transit to Penn Station. I would take the 2 train up to Prospect Avenue stop. That would be a one destination I went to a lot in the Bronx. And then I would walk, and I would walk all day. You know, I would take a 7 o'clock train from Montclair. I would be up in the Bronx at 8:30, and I would walk and, you know, get back usually to Penn Station in time to take a 6:11 train back. But to me, that was just like really a liberating, fun thing to think I'm not dependent on you know, just driving all over the place. And driving in Russia, you have a real sense like you're murdering the climate. Like they disconnect their catalytic converters. They burn really dirty fuel. And you just, you know, so I had burned a lot of dirty fuel, and I was happy to be doing it on foot. So,
do you know how many miles you got to total?
No, I set out to walk 1,000 miles. I started walking there in 2004. I did a lot of walking there before I ever did a piece. In fact, the first idea for this book was to be a book about the Stella D'Oro Bakery and about that strike. And then, so back then I wasn't measuring the mileage, but I was doing it. And I started out doing it. I didn't have a phone to tell me how far I walked. I could estimate it. But like one of the important historic sites in the book is the route that Jimmy Carter drove or had his limousine take him on October 5th, 1977. And I walked that many times because he went and the Times, New York Times, published the map of that route. And so I took that map and I followed it exactly and went all over the, you know, every place Carter went. And that's a 10-mile walk. And I did that many times. So, I mean, just in that, I probably racked up 100 miles. But I just, finally, I did start sort of measuring it toward the end, and I would measure how many miles I did in a day. But I don't have any idea. That's a long answer. I would say hundreds and hundreds, but whether I got to 1,000, I don't know.
How many pairs of shoes?
I used to, I brought my shoes. I didn't today, but Zach interviewed me, did a great interview for the New Yorker Radio Hour. And I wore my shoes, as you recall.
New Balances, I remember.
New Balances.
With, I think some holes
Well,
developing.
the thing is, they're good, sturdy shoes, but my toes point up. So I wore out the top of these shoes. But I went through a lot of pairs of shoes, and I got Achilles tendon things, but you know, it was just. You asked what you get from walking it. I mean, you get authority. You know, I had zero authority when I started this. You know, I mean, I'm not like the typical, you know, whatever a typical person is. I'm someone who lives in the suburbs, and I didn't know anything about the Bronx. I don't really know anything about the suburb where I live either, but uh, but I wanted to have a sense just from being on the ground, and also if you're on the ground, people talk to you, and people talk to you more if you're older. An old guy is somehow less threatening, or I don't know what, but it's fun to be an old guy and sit on a bench, and people come by and they say, "What you doing, Poppy?" And I'm like, I want to be Poppy. You know, I really like that. And so it's another way you meet people. You find out. A lot of people who I am still in touch with, I met walking on the street, you know, or in a playground or something like that.
I'm not going to call you Poppy if that's okay.
Okay, that's all right.
One of the delights in this book is there are so many characters, from the people you meet on the street to people like I think the star of the show in the early parts of the book for me were Governor Morris. First of all, I learned how to pronounce
You pronounced
Governor
it
Morris.
right. That's really, it's a hard name to pronounce. Yeah.
I imagine there was you probably went into this, I would imagine, not knowing a ton about him. What was your process of discovery like, and was it as joyful as it to learn all of these things about him? He was a very important historical figure in many ways, but just a colorful person, as you could explain a little bit. So what was it like for you to discover who he was and what he did?
There's dozens of things named after the Morrises, and lots of things in the Bronx, I'm saying, and lots of things named after Governor Morris. And you see, and ask somebody who was Governor Morris, and nobody knows. And I'll bet not many people here know that much about Governor Morris. And that you can know by going to the New York Historical Society, because it is on display. It's one of the first things you see when you come in, is this wooden leg. He was, to me, he was a really like mysterious but kind of proto-Bronxite person, in that he was very much an in-between person. He was enormously important in the Revolution. He is a founding father. He wrote We the People of the United States. He wrote the preamble to the Constitution, and he wrote there's like 3 key phrases for our country. That's well, that's because, so many people now use that to create a more perfect union. Why did he put it in? He was seriously anti-slavery. He made the most anti-slavery speech of anybody at the Constitutional Convention. The Constitution accepted slavery in a way, institutionalized slavery. He hated that. And I think that he put in to create a more perfect union as a way of saying, it's not perfect. This is not what I wanted. And Morris said at one point, I would just tax everybody and buy all the slaves and liberate them now and just get this over with. It'll cost us money, but he was. And then, of course, as when you turn over any of these people from a long time ago, you find he was, of course, a severe racist and encouraged the suppression of the rebellion in Haiti. And, he wasn't at all perfect. But a more perfect union is one of the things that we have in us, in the same way we have the pursuit of happiness. And they're both done by writers. This was a writer, and to me, the whole way you can look at the Bronx is as a literary creation, that it comes from a poem. I mean, it comes from the name of the Bronx River, but a poet in 1805 wrote a poem called Bronx, and it was a famous poem back then. And that, I think, put the brand name out there, and that's why when they kind of were looking at what are they going to call this place, Bronx was the natural choice. But to create a more perfect union were the words of a really interesting writer, not a great writer, but an interesting writer, Governor Morris. And the pursuit of happiness was a phrase by another really great writer, Thomas Jefferson. And they were both like just off the top of their heads. I mean, there was no legal or legislative mandate, please put those words in. They just came up with it. And so it's, to me, it speaks to the power of writers, which I always like to see increase.
What created, other than the subways, what factors created what you refer to as the Paradise Bronx, and what nearly destroyed it, or what ended the Paradise Bronx period?
Well, the Paradise Bronx, I speak of two real Paradise Bronx periods. After the Revolutionary War, the Bronx became kind of like what the Hamptons is today. And so a lot of people, the Tiffanys had a beautiful estate in the Bronx. People who, the Havemeyers, people who, big wheels in the city, that would be their summer estate. And you could take the train up there. Someone would pick you up in a stagecoach and take you to the houses of these wealthy people, and not that different from taking the jitney out to the Hamptons or taking the train out to the Hamptons. And that was kind of an initial Paradise period. And then you had an enormous amount of immigration at the end of the 19th century. And you had the Bronx's population go to like over 1 million by 1920. And when they built all these apartment buildings, and it was just this, some of the apartment buildings up there are the coolest in the city, and they have the best collection of Art Deco buildings along the Grand Concourse, I think, anywhere in the world. All these things were built in this just amazing optimism, and everything was named Paradise. The theater was Lowe's Paradise. The bowling alley across the street was Paradise Lanes. Everything, people saw it as a paradise. And what made it particularly paradisical was that they had paved all these streets. And you look at the pictures of the pavement, and they're just like, they're so beautiful. They're just gleaming, and they're largely empty because it was before the automobile was a big thing. So you had all these paved streets that offered all this room and not very many cars. And so, all these different games that people played, the stickball, which you can find lots of pictures of kids playing stickball, but all kinds of other games. And you had, basically, they were playing on the pavement. And when a car came along, you would say, "Car," and everybody would get up on the curb, and the cars would go by. When they decided to build highways after the Second World War, and that was a nationwide thing, but when they did it in the Bronx, they, those empty spaces where kids had played, they were not available anymore. And I remember when I was a kid, that was like a mean thing to say to children was, "Go play in traffic." And I realized there wasn't traffic before that. This is suddenly there's traffic, and you could say that to a kid. But it changed really drastically with the coming of the car, as the whole country did. But and it was also almost explicitly racist, in the sense that this is going to be segregated here, and this is going to be segregated, and in between you have the Bronx. So you're going through these. You're going from segregated place to segregated place across this an area that they had basically just decided to discard. But the end of the Paradise Bronx was a painful thing, and you still find lots of people talk about what it was like. Arlene Alda, Alan Alda's wife, did a really good book I think it's called Just Kids in the Bronx. And she talked to all these different people who had been kids in the Bronx. And they're just such cool stories about what it was like to play on the streets, and what it was like to, swim in the Bronx River and stuff like that. So it was, paradise came and went. But
one of the things that people get wrong about the Bronx is I think people have this conception that there was a white flight, that there was an increase in immigration, and a lot of the population moved out and hollowed out the neighborhoods. But you demonstrate that something else happened.
Well, I mean, I begin a chapter saying when blacks and Puerto Ricans moved in to the Bronx, it got better. And you really have to say that because people think, well, that was when it started to go downhill. That was when, certainly in terms of music, and my book kind of emphasizes music because the Bronx invented hip hop, and there's no question about it. And it is a global art form. And where else in the city can we say we invented a global art form? There were a lot of, combinations that happened once you got a population that diverse. You already had, a large Jewish population, but you also had Germans and you had Italians and you had Irish. And when you got this mix, there was a period where everybody says, well, we all were getting along. It was great. Gouverneur Morris High School was the most integrated high school in the U.S. And there were playgrounds. There was one playground in particular where they just reinvented basketball. And they sent the guy who ran that playground sent kids to play to the basketball team of University of Texas at El Paso, which is what's now called, and they won the NCAA championship. And in the first play, one of the guys went up and dunked on Pat Riley, who was later a coach of the Knicks. They were playing University of Kentucky, and overtly racist team, and they dunked on this player. And that right after that championship, the NCAA outlawed dunking. I mean, it was just an insane thing because, of course, everybody loves that, and there was so much fan protest that they had to reinstate it. But that type of like aerobatic basketball comes from this playground, Hilton White Playground, among other New York City playgrounds. But that was a place where it was nurtured, so that it was a great time. And then these buildings that had been up for 70 some years in some cases were just kind of falling apart. And then you had redlining, and redlining made it impossible to borrow in these neighborhoods. And when you look at a red line map and how they would change the rating of a neighborhood, and then you would see what the reason was, and it would be Puerto Rican infiltration. And then you would look, and there would, in this whole area that had been redlined, there's like 3 little apartment buildings that have Puerto Ricans, and how they then decided to redline the whole thing. But the redlining made it hard to borrow. Impossible, some people say, to borrow to fix up your place. The buildings became more, there were too many people living in the buildings, and the buildings started to burn. And that's kind of the low point of the Bronx, is like the 70s, early 70s. In 1976, there were 33,465 fires in the Bronx. And there's a very good book by a fireman of that time who said that for some long period of time when he was at the firehouse, he never ate an uninterrupted meal, that they're just rushing out to alarms all day. And that was, people looked the other way from that. But that was kind of the low point. And if you want to talk about where the paradise went, well, in the South Bronx, it went up in flames. I mean, and the flames were that was such a terrible plague that it jumped the Cross Bronx Expressway, and it was burning up around Fordham, which is like 1.5 miles north of the Cross Bronx. So the Lloyd Altan, who was the historian of the Bronx and just retired and is a wonderful guy and really a cool guy, says there was no white flight. And it's just, I don't think is true. But he says it's part of just the natural thing that always happens in the Bronx. You move there, you get a little bit ahead, and then you move on. And that's what a lot of neighborhoods in the city, that's what their function has been. And that wears a neighborhood out. So he says it was just them moving on the way everybody else had always done. But
the fires, I had long assumed they were mostly arson. But what were they due to?
Well, they were due to too many people in a building that was not well maintained, that had old wiring, and new appliances were plugged into it, and it was created like electrical problems that set things on fire. The fire marshal said only like 4% of the fires were arson, but the popular opinion was that, and it was encouraged by people like Moynihan, Senator Moynihan. You know, he said, well, the people of the Bronx must not want housing or they wouldn't burn it down. Well, they weren't. I mean, it was a lot more complicated than that. So,
They also mentioned the fact that they cut the number of firehouses.
well, that also was a big thing. They decided just to let the Bronx go back to grass, basically. And the idea was called planned shrinkage. And so they shrank services to the Bronx, and they closed firehouses at the height of this plague. So suddenly you have fire companies, you know, they'd get a fire alarm and they wouldn't have enough trucks, and companies were coming from as far as Staten Island, you know, from other parts of the city to put out Bronx fires because they had closed those firehouses. But yeah, thank you. Because that was, you know, the Rand Corporation recommended that the city do this, and the city did it. And it was, of course, the city was in a real severe financial pinch at the time. So it was a bad time throughout the city, but it was a terrible time in the Bronx.
You describe all this infrastructure that's kind of been shunted up and loaded into the Bronx, kind of like the city's attic. It's got all the ductwork
Right.
and everything that the rest of the city doesn't want to see.
Right.
I'm wondering if there's an alternate timeline. Like, was that inevitable, or were there other options for some of these throughways, or to not have them at all? And what would the borough look like had it not been loaded down by so much infrastructure?
That's a really good question, and I think about it a lot because I drive on those roads sometimes. I end the book by, I'm on my way to JFK to pick my son up at the airport, you know, flying in from Europe, and I'm on the Cross Bronx, and when there isn't traffic on the Cross Bronx, you can really get across the Bronx fast. And so I think, how could you have done this differently? Right now, there's a lot of money to mitigate the Cross Bronx. A lot of people that I've talked to say, you know, you could cover it over. But I think, I mean, I don't know anything about digging a tunnel, but, you know, why didn't they dig a tunnel? I mean, there's a tunnel across Chesapeake Bay. How come you didn't, at least for a good part of the way? Why not just tunnel under all this? Well, I mean, I have no idea the engineering of it, but it could have been, I do think it could have been done better, and you just have to believe it could have been done better. It's not like we're inevitably doomed to create what was created in the South Bronx and in other parts of the Bronx in the 60s. You know, it just, you have to think there would be another way to do it. I still can't quite figure out what it would have been, but the thing that I kind of realized as I read about it is everything that you see, like you see something and you think it was always like that. I mean, Vivian Vasquez, who made a really good documentary about the fires in the Bronx, said, well, the Bronx, when she was growing up there, she said, well, we thought this was just what you got for being poor. And everything was made. It was a decision that people made, and it didn't have to, you know, it wasn't just like, well, this is an inevitable thing that's going to happen. And I feel like, you know, when you do plan in a city, the idea that things are inevitable. I mean, they wanted to build a highway across Manhattan. They never succeeded. You know, they wanted to build a highway right across, slightly below Houston Street. And Ed Koch was the congressman from the area, and he just protested like crazy. And he said, if we do this, we'll end up, I'm paraphrasing, but we'll end up with what they've got up in the Bronx. Well, I mean, they knew. And so these decisions, people made them. And, you know, we make them. And you want to know, like, it's just like you take something apart and look back and say, well, okay, this is why it got like this. And to me, it's a fascinating It's a fascinating pursuit, and all the documentation is there. We have the best public library in the world, I think. I don't know any other public libraries of that size, but you can find all this stuff out. You can read it, and then you see how these things were done. And you don't want it to be something like this. You just don't want it to be repeated. I mean, it was like, we made huge parts of the city look like, World War II cities that were bombed. It was just absurd.
There's so much cause and effect in the book, from geography to, like you mentioned, the place where you place a highway and what that does. One of the most fascinating causes and effects of this was hip hop. You kind of show that hip hop emerged out of a few different very specific Bronx factors. And could you explain what those were?
I mean, you can kind of look at hip hop. I mean, trace it like to the Immigration Act of 1965, which opened the doors that had been closed by the Immigration Act of 1924. And you get all these West Indian people coming in, and West Indians had massive speakers. They liked big speakers, and they knew how to, they had a kind of dance tradition that involved these speakers. Then you have a large American Black population in the Bronx, and hip hop is like a combination of American R&B with a kind of West Indian view of really big, loud music. And to me, what they did in the Bronx was you took another cause and effect. You took music out of the schools. They cut music and art after the financial crises. And so all of a sudden you get kids who hadn't, they were just making it up themselves. And to me, hip hop is an answer to all the stuff that was done to the Bronx. It's like, we had the massive machines came in here, bulldozed everything, knocked everything down. This speaker is so big, we're going to plug it into a street light. And when we crank it up, the street light is going to dim. And all the street lights on the street, they're using so much power. And we're going to play this outside, another cause and effect. Nobody to complain because everybody had left, or a lot of people had left in some neighborhoods. The cops are saying, well, this is a loud party, but it beats a lot of other things that could be happening, so let's just let them do it. And you have this music that's blasting to the skies, I say in the Taft High School playing fields, which are these great big open playing fields behind one of the biggest high school buildings in the city. Those hip hop jams could be seen, I'm sure, could be seen from space. And so it's not unusual, it's not surprising that this is music that went around the world. But to me, this is the Bronx answering back, and I think it's the great invention. I think maybe we should go to questions if there are questions.
Sure. Yeah. If anyone has questions, we'll bring a mic. No, we won't bring a mic, but I will repeat the question so everyone could hear. So speak loudly and make sure that we can get it.
When you mentioned the red line, who imposed the red line? How is that played out?
Redlining.
Okay, so the question was who imposed the red lines?
The redlining came about in the 30s, and it was part of the point of redlining was it was to give unemployed real estate agents something to do. So they would go to neighborhoods and check out who lived in different neighborhoods. And this was like a real estate investor's guide. It was a kind of, I don't know that it necessarily, I think it was part of the federal government, or as part, but it was an investor's guide. So that there was like a, like you can buy a blue book to tell you how much your car is worth. You could find this guide and it would tell you, should you invest here? And it went to banks, and banks would look at the map and see where you were applying for your loan, where the building was. And they would say, oh, well, that's a red line neighborhood. And the maps are really kind of amazing because red line neighborhoods are red. They had a display of it up in the Bronx, and I was just blown away. Like the map is there, and there's this red line neighborhood, but somebody had colored it in with like a colored pencil. I mean, I don't know how they did it, but it was a really pretty map. And you had red, and then you had yellow, and then I think you had green and blue. And green and blue were okay, and yellow was a changing neighborhood, and red was like, don't go there. And when you would look and see the reason why this was redlined, I mean, it would have like some, because these were, some of the notations were just made by real estate, like guys just kind of coming up with it on there. But they would say, you know, Polish communists live here. And it's like one little building. Okay, so there's Polish communists, but you could still loan money. But it was a truly weird system of redlining. And so, like, before, I mean, to me, redlining was the thing, that was the puncture wound. And that was in the 30s. So that once loans became less and less available, the buildings become more and more run down, and there's no appeal. How do you appeal and say, why did they redline us? So it was. I think everybody was made nervous by the diversity of the Bronx. I think investors made them nervous.
And there's a tour, if you want to ride a bike, there's a tour de Bronx on the 6th of October. So.
I have a friend who does that, but yeah.
So I ran a tiny nonprofit in Bronx 16 years ago with community gardens all over the borough. And what I found was when you, and I now work at Lincoln Hospital, when you ask people what their neighborhood is in the Bronx, I'm wondering if you ever came across people talking about what I feel is there's no sense of neighborhood. They'll tell you what street they live on, but they don't talk about.
Well, this I've heard a lot from people who worked in the Bronx as it was being built up, that they said as it has, and gentrifying isn't necessarily like a lot of white people move in. Gentrifying is it becomes more expensive, and so more people move into an apartment, for example, and that you take more jobs. So what I have heard, you have to work harder to stay there, so that it's harder to get people for tenant meetings and stuff like that, because people are busier and they have to work harder just to support themselves. In terms of neighborhood, it is true people know streets, but if you say, are you in Norwood or are you in, the neighborhood next to it, they're not going to be real sure about that. And in my book, I drew maps of the Bronx sort of as a way for myself to help myself get a sense of this geography. But I have a map with all the different neighborhoods because I went and tried to figure out what neighborhood is where. And I still am really vague on neighborhoods. I find it very hard to, and when a newspaper will say, this shooting in the Edenwald neighborhood, and I think, Edenwald, I mean, how do you find, where is Edenwald? Some are easy, some are fairly easy to find, Fordham, a neighborhood like that, Kingsbridge, but a lot of them are quite vague, so it's true.
Can I just say one thing? I love the book. I had a lot of family contacts in Bronx from my father, who was a Russian immigrant, and a top student, a abandoned child in 1922, and my aunt lived in Riverdale. My wife worked with the homeless as a housing development in Congress Plaza. My tilt near the Vietnam War for drafted for the Pond Street. But I see it in the Bronx also. Is in fact a fact that people are using digitized maps now. They don't have a sense of a Hagstrom, the Hagstrom Atlas, which used to be the place to find different neighborhoods. You could at least lay it out, and people don't know that.
Yeah, this is a very good point about how people use digital maps. And I had the Hagstrom, and I wore out several Hagstroms, but I use my phone a lot too. And, right. It doesn't. It is a very different, and that's nationwide everywhere. That you don't know anything if you're just using your or you know it works to get you to the place, but it doesn't give you the overall view of it. And um, but I think in general, as a country, we're not good on geography, and it really is an important thing to know. You know, like they teach it at West Point. Why do they teach it at West Point? Because that's how you win. You know where where things are, and there's nothing more bizarre and unhappy than getting lost. Like getting lost on, and I got lost a lot when I would be walking around. But that's quite true about the Google Maps. It changes how you look at a place. Is this Chelsea technically? Okay. Yeah, I would say, yeah, I would, that would. Okay.
The question
Uh,
was whether Sandy's ever had an S&S cheesecake.
No. What is S&S cheesecake? Lloyd's carrot cake I've seen, but I have never, where is it? Okay. Yeah, I mean that. Huh. Yeah, the one place, I mean, this isn't all that close, but I go to Liebman's Deli. Have you ever been to that? To me, Liebman's is the best deli in the city, but that's actually Spite and Dival, I think, is its technical neighborhood. But
Question here.
So, where do you see the Bronx shifting next?
The question is, where do you see the Bronx shifting next?
I hope it remains a place that people can live when they come here, and I really hope that they do that. You know, I don't know anything really about what housing plans are happening, but there have been all these battles about gentrification, and like they're going to gentrify Jerome Avenue, and they came up, the way they rezoned Jerome Avenue is that you can't have industry there. And then they said an auto shop is industry. Well, there's like 1,000 auto shops on Jerome Avenue, and it's perfect. There's a Jerome Avenue exit from the Cross Bronx. You go up there, you want to buy flat fix, you want to get your a new tire, and it's all there. And I don't think they will get those businesses out of there. I think they will stay. And I think that people, they just need this, you know, you need a place where you can come. And what the immigration has been like in the last, you know, I mean, all kinds of people go there, and it's a place where you can start out. And one of the guys who works in housing, who I interview in this, just says, you know, you want to have a place in the city where someone can move and get a job and be near public transportation and be not that far from a park and have a school she can send her children to. And in the richest city, I don't know, in the world, whatever New York is, in this rich city, that shouldn't be impossible. And the fact that New York gets totally pushed around by real estate, it's horrifying. And it's no accident that this horrible candidate for president made his money in real estate in New York. I mean, that like this is, real estate has too much power here. And speaking of Robert Caro, he wrote a beautiful piece saying, you know, what are different cities? What is Paris? Well, the city of light, you know. What is London? When you think of a city, what is this city? When you think of New York City, what is it? And he said, it's home. You know, I have a whole thing in there about the Statue of Liberty and the Statue of Liberty green. And why is that color? Why does your heart leap up to see that color? Because it's a color of arrival. It's a color of, hey, we're here, you know, and it's a color of, well, this is our home. And I think that because of that, you know, there's people that provide homes have a huge amount of power. And I really don't know more about housing than that. It's a really complicated subject. I talked to a lot of people about it, and I still don't feel I got past the first page of the text. But it's like, again, what I said, decisions are made that create these things, and you just have to be aware of the decisions and know that they're not inevitable. It's not inevitable. You can build what that guy said, you know, that housing advocate. You can build a place that people can come and have a good life. I don't think it's impossible.
Sandy, could you talk a little bit about the way the book took the form that it took? To agree that it was improvisational and sort of follow the meanderings of the walk versus having a framework that you fill in all this wonderful detail into?
The question was how the book was structured, how it took the form it did.
Well, I just sort of wrote about things that interested me and moved on to the next thing that interested me. I mean, to me, the structure is, in a way, I hope people will look at the maps that I drew. That's the structure. It's this place. And it wasn't like I wasn't telling a story, one story. I was telling a lot of different stories that I hoped would add up. And I guess I do need like a little bit, you have to kind of trust me. My wife says I put speed bumps at the beginning of my books, but you have to know it is going somewhere. And I hope I did have enough momentum that people think this is going somewhere. But I don't know.
Well, you can tell you're getting played with in a very pleasing way. And I love the lists.
Well, I'm totally into lists. That's always been the main way I wrote, was lists. But anyway.
Well, thank you, Sandy. Thank you for this book. There are more books for sale over here, and I think Sandy's going to be signing some books as well.
I can sign books. Thank you all for